the world of the internet.
It can get a bit much sometimes.
I don't know.
Pretty much, yeah.
Welcome to
Move Over Mother Teresa.
What is my purpose? What am I gonna contribute to the world?
Interviews with creators who
Show the world
give
vulnerability and masculinity.
Encourage consciousness.
shit.
Can I swear?
So we've got Rory Bradshaw coming in, another one of your talents, Fee. Tell us about Rory.
So Rory is honestly such an amazing creator. He's like very much somebody on like kind of the cusp of culture and a bit of like a role model. He is somebody that has worked in various kind of communities as like a social worker and moved into the kind of health and wellness creator world where he was like, you know, showing his health like routines, that kind of thing. But actually he has really become a prominent figure in the kind of world of like masculinity and what masculinity, the myriad versions of masculinity that are out there. And he uses his channel to talk about the myriad ways of being within like the sort of masculine world. He talks about like being a role model. He is very much somebody who is getting his audience to question, I guess, sort of the states of the world in terms of like their identity and where they fit as a male. And he's been, yeah, like I said, a real role model and somebody who's really sort of championing change and asking people to really question those like perhaps like the limitations of their mind, of who they think they're meant to be, but also I guess the structures that underpin these very kind of gendered norms. You know, the fact that we have more young boys turning to the internet for depictions of who they can be rather than finding it in their like communities. So yeah, he's super impressive, and I think he talks about really very complex subjects, but with ease. He's extremely eloquent. He's got a story as well. There's like, you know, there's lots in his background, the experiences that he's had during his work that's really played a place.
Yeah, so I think this is where a lot of his credibility comes from, because the eloquence with how he talks is amazing, which we'll hear. But he's had through his work, he's spent a lot of time in environments where masculinity is very much at the extreme of what is problematic, right? So he's a yoga teacher in prisons, is that right?
That's right, yeah. I think he's been volunteering for, I think it's like 4 or 5 years now. Every week he goes into the prison and teaches like 1 or 2 classes, so like yoga and breath work, you know, with very different men within, you know, that environment. And he's learning like all the time. You know, he's very much somebody, not just like the sort of prison, he's worked with, you know, older gentlemen. He's worked with, you know, as a social worker for young people. So he's got this very deep understanding of like different environments and how those kind of like structures play out and what that means to the people within them. For, you know, from like prisoners to, you know, older guys, you know. So he's really, really interesting and has that very credible lived experience.
Interesting. I find, and this is because I think so many conversations online are quite surface level, but I find when people bring up masculinity, it never really, the depth of conversation isn't there. And so I don't find it interesting as like a top line subject. But having spoken to Rory a few times now and seeing the way he approaches the topic and all of the things you mentioned, I think that's why he's kind of the perfect guest to broach this. I'm particularly interested in, yes, the dynamics within the prison system that force men to perform masculinity in a very specific type of way, and how outside of the prison system, actually young men are fed that quite quickly in their lives, but there's this plethora of other ways you can be a man, and Rory represents some of those things. But most interestingly, I find the effect of pruning people into those roles, into these stereotypical versions of masculinity, I find the effect of that really interesting. Does that lead them to end up in prison? Does that lead to violence? Does that lead to loneliness and suicide and isolation? Does that force them into small communities that aren't that healthy? Or does it force them onto the internet to look for depictions of what they can be rather than looking to the people around them who might love them and be able to support them in a different way? So I'm surprisingly excited for a conversation about masculinity.
Yeah.
I think also we live at a very interesting moment in time in terms of this discussion around masculinity, right?
It's really at like a crisis point, I would say.
It's at a crisis point because, you know, the traditional idea of masculinity is what has been thrown out the window, you know, quite rightly, right? You know, the stuff that perhaps is still held over in prisons in terms of being strong and powerful and the provider and all these kind of things and all of what becomes problematic from that. But it's safe to say as well that the change, at least for the moment, has led to a real unknown as to what it is a man should be. And as a father with a 5-year-old son, actually, this is the thing that scares me most, that keeps me up at night the most.
Yeah, and I bet if it was 10 years ago, it would have been thinking about my girl, right? Yeah. So it's interesting how that has flipped now, so that we're actually more worried about young boys than we are about young girls.
What specifically do you think about when you think about your son at nighttime?
Well, I think, again, traditionally, the idea for him would have been grow up, be strong, be funny, be loud, provide. Now, he should be none of those things, according to a sort of new definition. And so what scares me is exactly what is happening, and is as depicted in shows like Adolescence. That there is now a void, there is now a lack of definition. There's not a new definition yet, there's just a lack of definition, and that creates a void, and that void pushes young boys into trying to find their own definition of masculinity in places where people can take advantage of it, such as the Tate brothers and so on. So I think it's really difficult. As a parent, you can only do so much in creating those guardrails and trying to coach and understand together what a man is. But he's going to exist in a world and in a culture that at the moment at least cannot define clearly what a man should be, what a role they should play. Yeah. And that is petrifying. That is petrifying.
As an individual, do you have an idea of what you think a man should be? Not every single one, but even perhaps for yourself.
And it's difficult to answer this question without being reductive, but it's compassionate, it's thoughtful, it's standing up for what you believe in, and for those that you believe in, and for those that aren't like yourselves. It is providing in a broader sense than we perhaps traditionally understood.
Which is traditionally what financially, roof over your head, food.
I think it's actually just providing for all around you in whatever way you can, taking responsibility and accountability for that. So it's all these things that probably seem and sound quite obvious. This is the point I think that's really interesting with someone like Rory, who's so elegant and eloquent at talking about all of this, is that it's not just that the definition of a man has changed, it's that the man's role has not yet been defined as this culture shifts. So if there's one question we want to get answered by the end of this, it's not just how to be a man, it's how to be.
No pressure.
No pressure. We've got 45 minutes.
Do 5 rounds of this yoga-inspired flow each morning to help build a strong and flexible body. From a kneeling back bend, step back and then lower yourself from high to low plank. I've been teaching yoga in prison for 5 years and it doesn't get any easier.
Prisons were already full, and not full of so-called illegal immigrants, not full of trans people. They were, and still are, full of men.
There's a Simone de Beauvoir quote that I really like, which is, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman." And I think there's a similar thing for men, right? We're born and then we learn how to perform sex. And it's rehearsed until it feels real. And so I wanted to ask you, what is that version of masculinity that you think men are taught to perform? And if you don't think that was a great starting question.
Okay.
Yeah, that was good. Nice quote.
Thank you.
I guess there's nuance to it depending on, your race, your heritage, the area you grew up in, all those influences. But there's kind of a sort of global, seemingly like mainstream thread of masculinity that's most celebrated, and it tends to be the men that are in positions of power, the CEOs, the politicians, and I find that those guys exhibit certain quite traditional traits of masculinity, being, strong-willed and terrible at listening, and quite kind of forceful, aggressive, competitive, and so on. And I suppose the problem that comes as a man if you're growing up, and those are the kind of celebrated heroes that you see around you that you're kind of told are successful, and you don't quite click with them, you're kind of left a bit stuck unless you have other examples in your close circle or online maybe nowadays where you can kind of think, oh, actually there are other ways of showing up as a man which are also successful, like which are also a kind of healthy and positive performance of it. But I don't think men tend to think about it that much. It's kind of like, maybe when I'm now obviously doing the work I do, I've paused and I've stopped and I've like reflected, but a lot of it's kind of, it just unfolds as you get older and you're not really thinking about it, but all you really see is like, okay, I've probably got, one or two guys I really look up to, whether you like to admit it or not, and you probably want to like orientate yourself towards them.
How in those early like formative years are you subtly molded into this particular form of a man?
I suppose it's, you kind of realize that there's that thread of masculinity you need to fit into anytime you try and step outside of it. So it could be at school when maybe you try wearing a slightly different color of top that's maybe beyond black, grey or blue. And then someone's like, what's that all about? And then you kind of retreat back in,
Isn't it funny? It's such a tiny thing, but it's so significant.
Yeah. Or maybe it's like the music you listen to. Or for example, I remember when I was at primary school and I just, my mum had bought me Baywatch Ken. And like Baywatch Ken was like my favourite toy. Absolutely loved him. And he was fun. He was cool. He would go to the beach, and play with the dolphins and stuff. But he was an action man. And so I took him into school and was like showing him off and stuff. And I thought, yeah, like great, love it. And then some of the other boys were like, not sure about this guy. And then I kind of held it in all day and was like really embarrassed, and I didn't sort of know what to do with what they said to me. And I got home, and just as I was falling asleep, my mum said to me, are you sure you're okay? And then I just burst into tears and was like, someone said Ken was stupid. And didn't bring him in again, Yeah. And even as a kid, I was playing with my sister's Polly Pocket, toys and stuff.
Polly Pocket.
Yeah, so good. But I wouldn't, I learned that I keep that at home, I keep that quiet, and I stick to the norm.
So it's those little things that all add up, that all break off, a little part of you and make it and keep you kind of smaller, and not even smaller, but like in the box that you're supposed to be in, isn't it?
Exactly, yeah.
I think there's a nuance to that moment as well, because it tends to be around puberty as well, when your hormones are going all over the place, where you realise two things as a young boy. And one is that, again, you have to blend in socially, but at the same time you have to stand out. Actually, as a young boy, I think, if you're just talking about the game of finding a mate, I think there's more of an onus on like standing out to girls, as there might be the other way around. Either way, like as any teenager, to be at that point, just when your hormones are going all over the place, to have this challenge, this totally opposing challenge of needing to blend in yet stand out at the same time, is so difficult to navigate, because if you get it kind of slightly wrong once, or you just get someone say something mean to you in that moment, then your willingness to stand out and be anything other than is prescribed becomes
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you know what it makes
very
me
minimal.
think of? This is a big generalization, but I see conversations about, and I have conversations with my female friends that are like, some movie characters are written by a man and some feel like they're written by a woman. And a lot of women, Thor, for example, feels like he's written by a man for men. Like this is a guy, this is like a hench guy. He's tall, he's really powerful, he's a god. And actually the guys that women tend to, I don't know, I'm talking about heterosexuality here, but the guys that women often go for are like the Lokis of the world and the others. And I just think, as much as that is a big generalization, it's interesting to see the way that men see each other and what qualities will make you successful in finding a mate or in operating out in the world, versus how women see and value those qualities in a man or in their partner. But it's really hard to make somebody else see that, especially if you're dating them or in a relationship. It's really hard to say, actually, we really love these like tender, vulnerable qualities that you have spent years kind of amputating from your personality because that's what you've been taught. And tell me what you guys think here. Is there, when you spend so long getting rid of or hiding those pieces of yourself, like playing Polly Pocket, loving Ken, whatever, do you end up with this dissonance between who you are on the inside and then who you are out in the world? Because that feels like a very uncomfortable place to be.
I'd say yes, but what the great thing about growing older is you can end up finding and placing yourselves in environments where you're more able to like bring your full authentic self to it. And I think for me as like a straight white man, it's like I can get by in the world like day to day fairly okay being like more or less like the version of myself I need to be. And there's also different versions of ourselves. I spend part of my week in prison and then part of it doing something like this with you guys, and then part of it at home with my wife and so on. And I'm always a slightly different like shade of masculinity in all those versions in order to like connect with those people, but it's still me. But it was kind of interesting. It was kind of revealed to me recently. I run a men's community, and one of the biggest bits of feedback I get is from gay men who attend, and they describe how it's so unusual for them to be hanging out with straight guys doing a shared activity like a hike or a yoga class or whatever, and not feeling threatened. And it kind of exhibits...
It's confronting as well, that truth, right? Yeah.
It is.
It says a lot about the world and how it's set up.
Yeah, exactly, for like a certain type of way of showing up as a man, that it's literally threatening to like someone else based on their experiences. So the safety of the environment, I think, is like above all what's important.
Can I ask, at what age did you, or what time in your life did you think about masculinity in like a different way, and maybe made it more of a conscious effort to demonstrate different versions of masculinity?
Particularly so since I went online on social media and people started saying to me like, oh, you're exhibiting like a healthy version of masculinity. And I was like, am I? Like, okay. But then reflecting on it, I think it's the moment at which I started working with a lot of young boys. Because when I first graduated from uni, I started working in a exclusion unit in a secondary school, which was largely full of young boys who've been excluded from the mainstream school and were trying to get back into it, or if things didn't go well, they'd be asked to leave the school entirely. And there was just such a common theme amongst all these boys of like, well, they really are just replaying out anger, violence, frustration, because that's all they really have the language to do. Yet there's so much going on underneath all that, so much kind of sadness or hurt or happiness or whatever it is that they weren't allowing to come out, which meant that they just were stuck in this really harmful cycle to themselves and those around them of just like always playing out the young, angry boy. Mm-hmm. And I found that in my role as just being a teaching assistant with them, I was able to, often not in the group, usually like kind of one-to-one or one-to-two setting, bring out other parts of them and allow them to just have a bit more of a whole experience of their childhood, enjoy themselves a bit more and be a bit more free. And it's really just seems to be such a prison it holds young men into.
What can we do about that at that kind of level, that age? What can we do to help? Obviously you were helping, but just more broadly.
Big question, Fee.
Sorry. I have got another question.
No, I can go with that if you want. I think we have to make it acceptable for young men to be inspired and have role models who are men and women. I think like we talk a lot about the need for a positive male role model, and it is so important. Like for me, that was my dad. He definitely showed me a lot of the ways in which I could become a happy man. But he also showed me a lot of things I didn't want to take on. And actually there was most things, it was my mum showed me, like my sensitivity and my emotional life was a lot more like learned from her. And I think most young boys, they're more likely to have a mum in their life than a dad. There's a real issue with like fatherlessness or absent fathers. And I don't always think that's a terrible thing. I think mums, like, and that femininity, we just have to make it a bit more acceptable for them to embrace that, and not always look to like the man to be kind of, growing up these children. Because, almost all of my male friends, if you get it down to it, like you say, like who's the person that's always been there for you through the ups and the downs and guided you in life? It's their mum.
So there was this research done by Male Allies UK, and they interviewed over like 1,000 boys about their about whether they care about women's issues. And I think it was something like 32% said they didn't think, issues surrounding women or women were like important like at all, which is just really shocking that even though, yes, like you say, you made the point, a lot of young men will be looking to their mothers and there will be, female role models around them. They don't think that their, what they represent or, their issues are important. It's really quite shocking statistic, I think. And there was also a stat in there as well. I think it was like over 70% of young men didn't know what masculinity really was. Like they couldn't define it. Which I think it speaks to the time we are in at the moment. And myself, Tom and Mira were talking about this just before you came in, about like masculinity like really being like in crisis at the moment, and there being such like a strong conversation about like how not to be a man, and it's leaving men unable to see like where they kind of fit in. And curious to know what your thoughts are on that.
I think there's definitely a conversation around there being a crisis of masculinity, and that is great that is sparking conversation. And it's a very loud conversation, and it's very divided, and it becomes very binary of like, men should be like this, no, men should be like that. I suppose my belief is that through this crisis, there's really an opportunity to kind of reimagine a new masculinity. And actually it's an opportunity to like, for all of men to kind of redefine it and to actually spend time doing the work and looking inside themselves and thinking about how they want to show up in the world, regardless of, the noise that's being made. So I think it's like actually an exciting and quite a hopeful time. And whilst a lot of the conversation around male identity and mental health is also going to be quite like extreme, and undoubtedly there are issues that we can't ignore around like male depression and suicide rates and like sense of identity and so on. Loneliness, exactly, yeah. We have to use this as an opportunity to just like create new paths for men to move forward, I think. So that's what I try and do with my men's community. It's what I'm trying to do through the yoga classes and what I make online. It's kind of like, okay, let's actually have the conversation. Because I think for a long time, men have just been able to just not have the conversation and just ignore it. And that's been like almost the easier choice. And I think women have had to do a lot of work to like find their voice and find their empowerment and kind of overcome a sort of systemic oppression in order to like thrive. And now it's like time for men to also do a bit of work.
I think this is incredibly empowering starting point, actually, because it was only, I think, a couple of months ago, and I sort of at the time saw this as a real watershed moment. As Obama, of all people, came out and said, clearly on the right, it's a show of hyper masculinity at the moment, but he said on the left, we've just spent too long talking about all the things that men are bad at rather than any of the things that men are good at. And at the time I thought that there sort of signifies what we're talking about in terms of where we are, in terms of like this definition clearly not being it, but then over here there's a sort of overcorrection, and here we are just left in the middle with a void. But so that can feel like quite a scary moment. But actually, to your point, what it leaves us at is an opportunity to just look within ourselves. And actually this transcends being a man, being a woman, being anything, right? Of just doing the work and looking inside and thinking, what can you find that can define you on your terms? And I think this is a really empowering thought.
Hi, it's Mira, just a quick one. Can you send me a voice note letting me know who you want to donate your ad slot to for your episode?
Hey Mira, so I'd like to use the ad slot to recognise Carney's Community, a charity that I worked for many years and that exists to support young people and adults who have been through adverse childhood experiences, those facing poverty in the care system and impacted by gun and knife crime. And Carneys are just great because they provide long-term, consistent, unconditional support to those who need it most. And they also provide a safe space through the youth club, the boxing gym, the music studio and the bike workshop, so that young people can find that place where they can really thrive with proper support from trained youth workers.
Yeah, I first volunteered in prison when I was 23 years old.
I don't want to date you, but that's about 10 years ago, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
10 years ago. Which is kind of mad to think. I'm not even sure quite why I decided to volunteer for a charity then and do some mentoring. But it revealed to me that even in the most kind of toxic and hard and harsh environments for men to exist in, I still find a lot of hope, and I still find a lot of reasons to be really hopeful about men. I mean, a lot of the guys I meet in prison have ended up there because they've done something which has caused harm to someone else, usually. And often it's like them playing out a version of what they think being a man is, and it's ended up in a violent act, or it's come from a place of misogyny, or whatever it is. And yet there is they are not wholly bad people, they're not wholly bad men. And I go in there and I work with them and I might teach them yoga or do mentoring with them, and I find, humanity within them. Well, I was in there this week and we had a laugh, with some of the guys, and they really showed me that they do want to become better versions of themselves. They do want to emerge out of prison and not come back. And they're trying, but due to the conditions of their upbringing and their circumstances and what they've done, it's really hard for them. And they are very much at the kind of pinnacle of where does a toxic masculinity lead us to. But I remain hopeful, for sure.
And I suppose the very practice of yoga itself actually, to some degree, it forces the people you support in prison to question that idea of masculinity, right? Again, it seems absurd to me. I've practiced yoga for 10 years and, but it is it's a little bit like nail polish, right? It's for a lot of proper men, as you describe it wrongly. Yoga is not something they would normally consider doing.
Yeah. But that's such a learned idea. It's such a good example of a learned idea of what it is, right?
Totally.
Also a cultural thing as well.
Yeah.
I think in my culture, men would do yoga in it. It's not a
Exactly.
problem.
Yeah.
Where it originates from in India, it's mostly practiced by men, from what I've understood, but it's also a kind of a way of life, and it's kind of been diluted into a sort of a physical stretching exercise for middle-aged women, And it just takes, 10 minutes of moving and breathing for the guys to realise that, I haven't turned into a woman, or and it's just, it's a great way of just peeling back the layers of that they've kind of placed on themselves of men don't do this, you know.
How do you, when you go into a yoga class, you have these people come in, how do you begin to peel back those layers? Because they might come to it with a bit of a front on, they're performing this kind of, is it hegemonic masculinity when they come into the prison? It's this environment that really rewards you for being that type of man, and then they come into your class, they're met by you, and you're like, let's do some yoga. How do you face that kind of masculinity?
I just try to punctuate the atmosphere that exists in prison, which is a very, as you said, a harsh and a loud environment where you're always having to look over your shoulder, and there's a hierarchy, and it's all about power, whether that's amongst the prisoners or amongst the institution itself. It's a power place where any small bit of power you can have, you will try and hold on to that for dear life. And I go in there with the aim of just providing an alternative space for the men to exist in for an hour. And through the yoga, through the breathing, the meditation, and the kind of guidance I offer, I really just try to encourage them to let go of the need to perform, let go of the need to exist in that power structure for a moment, and to just actually look inwards and to just notice physical feelings, emotions that rise up, thoughts that occur in their minds, and so on. And what I observe is that's a very relieving for them.
Something that I thought initially when I would read about people going to teach yoga in a prison, you go in for an hour, you come out, I thought, well, it's so fleeting. It doesn't really address the real problem here. It's not, because there's no systemic change we need to address. And I was thinking, our ethical responsibility is to, fix the entire system, and that's obviously long-term change. But reading up more about this, I realized actually there is a lot in just punctuating the moment and kind of existing with them as people in that moment. Something that you said to me that I found really interesting was you don't really talk about, some of these men are in there for quite violent crimes, and you don't ask them, why are you in here? You don't really talk about that sort of thing. You just meet them as people where they are in this space, because you said to me that you don't see it as your job. Like why don't you tell me what you see your job as there?
Yeah, I don't see my role as to be punishing them or rehabilitating them in the entirety. You know, I really do just want to present to them a different way of showing up, which is less performative, and I want them to have better tools, whether that's through the pranayama, the breathing exercises, or through an ability to move their body in a way which feels less painful and better. Those tools of well-being, so that they can like look after themselves a little bit better, and then kind of go back onto the wing a slightly calmer version of themselves, a slightly healthier version of themselves, maybe then to then leave the prison feeling like they've got, you know, something in their toolkit now to fall back on when times get difficult, all right? But it's really like a foundation of flourishing in life, and without it, like, the mental health goes, physical health goes, and so on. It has such a consequence to it. So yeah, I just see my role as introducing to something they might not have ever done before, showing them that it's not for women or just gay men, or, you know, it's not going to like morph them into something they're not. It might reveal to them some things they didn't know about themselves. You know, often there's a transition through a class where they come in and they're very agitated, and by the end of it, they're very soft and they're very quiet and they're very reflective, and that opens up conversations. Like, you know, recently there was a man and he was describing how he's got a difficult relationship with one of his children, and like the meditation allowed him to really think about them in a different way, and he actually learned to have a bit more understanding of that person and that relationship through the process of just having a bit of space to lay and think about it, you know. And so I think in a place which is so busy and loud, in some ways you've got all the time to think in the world, but in other ways you've got no time to think clearly at all. It's quite a valuable tool.
Yeah.
I would like to go on to now like your online persona, and because it just reminded me, you know, a very busy world where maybe you don't have like time to think.
Yeah, I guess that's true. I think I've not always felt able to step into like joy in my life, and I've had periods where I found life very difficult, and I think I'm sure I'll find life very difficult again sometime very soon, maybe even next week, you know. Like, I find life to be so messy and, you know, feeling great one day and pretty rough the next, and so on. And without kind of pretending like my life's fantastic, just give quite an honest depiction of my life. And that means, yeah, sharing like the things that really light me up, which is spending time and being in love with my wife, and being with other men that like let me be my true self.
Something that you just said there, I think really resonates with me, and actually having seen a lot of your content, I think it comes through as, because you show those highs and lows, because you show when things don't necessarily go right, which is at odds with this idea of a man who's in control and needs to, and like, you know, is very, those things that we were describing at the start, right? It shows that you are just a person and things happen to you and you're not always in control, and all of these various sides to you. And you mentioned shame, and I think this is right, but in the 1990s, there was this psychologist, I think, in prisons, who found that a lot of violence stemmed from shame, and that men would use violence to kind of gain back some dignity and power. And obviously that's very apparent in the prison system, but actually on varying, like maybe a lesser scale, can be seen outside in the world. And you showing people that you don't need to be ashamed is actually probably a very, very powerful thing.
I mean, it's very relevant for today.
Yeah.
Rory just released a video this morning about shame.
I did, yes.
I have not seen it yet.
No, yeah.
We'll put a clip in now.
It replays old memories in my mind and gives me a knot in my stomach. And this voice is my shame. And as men, we carry it quietly, letting it lurk inside our minds in dark corners, showing up as frustration or perfectionism. But it's a burden that we actually don't have to carry, because shame dies when you bring it to the light.
I spoke about shame because I think that it's probably the thing that like cripples men more than anything. Because, like we spoke about earlier, there is this like singular thread of acceptable masculinity for the most part in our culture. Whenever you deviate from that, you're shamed for it, and you therefore kind of internalize those feelings of discomfort and embarrassment and so on, and you don't speak about them. And everyone's saying, you know, men need to talk, but like often men have had experiences where when they do talk about, you know, the most embarrassing things that have happened to them or they've done, it's not usually received very well. And so the shame gets put deep down. I think I use this phrase of like it hides in like the dark corners of men's minds, you know, and yet it always kind of like haunts us, I think, because it kind of, regardless of how much you're thriving in your life, there's always that nagging voice of shame in your head that's like, oh, but what about the time when you did that? It's like, oh, all that time. Oh, it just takes you back to like random memories that like you just really want to let go of, but you can't because you don't talk about them.
Which to some degree is natural, right? We all lay in bed at night and something horrendous, like just something really embarrassing comes to your mind. But when you're not really allowed to speak about it without judgment, as men probably are more than women, because we'll sit down and we'll be like, oh God, I did this thing. It probably really makes that build up inside.
Yeah. And that must, even just hearing you say that is such a freeing idea. Like you could just sit down with someone and just be like, oh my God, I can't believe I did this thing, you know?
The voice notes my friends get.
Yeah.
Like 7 minutes long.
Yeah. And I feel lucky now that I've managed to develop male friendships in the last few years, especially where I'm able to like have those conversations with my male friends. But for many years I just couldn't, and I would usually reserve those conversations for anyone, possibly in like a partner, but particularly what I've found is in my therapist, going to that, you know, confidential space without judgment, where they just listen and together you work through it. It's become more digestible, and it's ultimately just freeing. You know, I think people sometimes say to me about my content, like, oh, how do you show up so vulnerably? And I think it's just practice of just like repeatedly bringing the shame into the light and just like talking about it, naming it, and then gradually it does tend to dissolve away.
Yeah.
That is just me to a T. I do everything I should do when I have no other option. You know, when I get to really, really low points.
Yeah.
And I come out of that, it often takes months. And then because I've come out of that place, I drop all the stuff that I need to do actually when I'm not in a bad place. You know?
It's so interesting, isn't it? Yeah. Right. I was the same. It took me 5 years after my dad died to start going to therapy. But from like the day even before he died, I knew like, oh, therapy would be a good idea for me to like process this. And then I just, you know, arrogantly assumed like, I'll work it out, you know, I'll just do all the right things. I'll be fine. And then, you know, luckily I then started going and it's really helped me, but I so wish for those 5 years, my life could have been a lot less painful if I had just been a bit more proactive and sought help, you know, before that point where I just hit rock bottom.
Or sought community.
Yeah.
But part of me often wonders, you know, I feel most proud of myself when I get help, you know, and I'm doing all the right things and surrounding myself with healthy relationships and all that kind of stuff. So it's not that I have, you know, an aversion to, you know, to getting help or being dependent on others. But when I'm struggling, it's almost like I have to get to a point where I'm really struggling. It's like I have to hit a rock bottom.
Even if you felt it before.
Yeah, you know, it's like I don't learn from it. And I don't know, you know, again, it's sort of, this isn't meant to turn into a therapy session. But it feels like quite a male tendency, right? You know, to, for whatever reason, feel, I wonder actually if it's related to shame, actually. Just like not feeling like I deserve that help yet. You know, I'm not in enough pain to really go and sort myself out yet. But
yeah. And I think there's the dominant conversation in a lot of men's culture is to embrace hardship and grind and push. And, you know,
No
through
pain, no gain.
no pain, no gain, and through adversity is where you learn most of your lessons and so on. And there's 100% truth in a lot of that. And like most good things do end up coming through after having pushed through like an element of discomfort. But I think men tend to like refine that conversation to just like working out or working hard. And I'd like to just see men broaden that out a bit to be like, okay, where's my emotional life? And like, actually, it's probably harder for a man to commit to like 10 therapy sessions than commit to doing, you know, going to the gym every day.
Yeah, you said something really lovely the other day because we were talking about like this as a concept, and you know, you said I would like more men to just feel more content. You know, that they don't have to struggle. Not every day has to be a struggle. They can live their life, you know, with ease. And maybe that's something that men struggle with as well, just like having a life of ease.
I would love that, yeah. I would like to ask you guys, how, as women, how you find hearing men talk about the conversation that men need to be having in themselves, and like, yeah, whether you find it almost like sweet, you know, or...
Well, I have two younger brothers, and, you know, I do worry so much about them in this world. I think I have probably played a part when I was younger in, you know, being a little bit anti-man or anti like masculinity. Like I've always have been very, very conscious of men that flex their masculinity, you know, hard masculinity too much. Like it makes me feel really uncomfortable. And so I think as, you know, I grew up in my 20s, I was very like anti-man, you know, men do this, And I know that actually, you know, I had my reasons for thinking that because men have made me feel very scared in my life. And, but my reaction to it is, you know, is not being, that's not great. It's contributed to this, perhaps this wave that we're seeing at the moment where like, you know, there's lots of things that have contributed to this wave of, people not being very happy with men, and, you know, calling them out. And, yeah, there's lots of behaviours that I think all genders could work on, but there has been definitely, and you know, we have to remember as well, we're in this like era where there's a lot of violence against women and girls. You know, there's a lot of deaths, a lot of murders, and it's happening all over the world. So of course people are, you know, they're angry and they want change, and I do too. But I think that it's actually, there's certain ways there's certain behaviours you can like limit to make that conversation a little bit kind of easier. And I also, you know, I work in social media, and I love it. I think it's you know, it can be a brilliant tool. But what I don't like is this, you know, it's become like extremely like polarized, and you know, you're for or against, you're for women or for men, and you know, there isn't that many spaces within, you know, the social media landscape where people can have like very nuanced and longer form expression, which is why I'm like really excited actually about like more people going back to maybe like YouTube as a platform where they can talk a little bit, you know, because I think so many young people, and generally most people, when they look at media, go for media now, you know, if they look into Netflix, you know, and it's like watching a specific kind of program rather than having like we used to have on as when we were younger, the TV on all the time and hearing lots of different kind of expressions. But yeah, I do feel you know, I take it upon myself to act more responsibly and try and contribute to the conversation in a much more helpful way now. But yeah, what do you think, Mira?
I didn't grow up around a lot of men. I had just my uncle, who's like a big brother to me. So I saw him grow up from like a teenager to to what he is now. But in my mind, he's permanently like 23 and being a nuisance. But that was really the only male role model I had. Was like a big brother to me, but was fun, right? And I wasn't really exposed to, I went to an all-girls school, wasn't really exposed to any men. In fact, all the experience that I have of like being in a primary school with boys was that they were just mean. They were not very kind. Yeah, so it's a funny one because like Fee, have been experienced violence by men, have experienced like feeling very threatened and afraid of men. And so I think that's meant that I am around a lot of queer men and women, but I actually don't have a lot of conversations with straight men, and I don't have a lot of positive interactions with straight men. In fact, working with Tom and John was the first time I had a really good experience in the workplace working with men. Felt really safe, but also protected and looked after and nurtured. And it was just a really nice environment to be in. So to be completely honest, this type of thing is very new to me because there aren't any men, I think, in my life that I could sit down with for an hour, 2 hours and just be like, what are you thinking? How do you feel? How can I help? And without those conversations, I just automatically assume, well, this is how we can fix it. I'm a fixer. I'm like, oh, we'll do this. And actually, that's probably not that helpful. So hearing these type of conversations, I feel a little bit sad for you guys because I think it's tough. And that's not to say, God, being a woman isn't really freaking tough. But I do feel sad, but it's also because I just don't really get to hear men talk about it in a safe environment where I also feel safe and can ask questions without judgment and can, learn. So it's odd, to be completely honest, It is really odd.
That's interesting. Even this experience of you three here is like not so usual for me. Like obviously the podcast aside, like just having a conversation between two, you straight man, Tom? Yeah. And women.
Nice try. I thought you said nice try.
Depends on you.
I'm so sorry. We try to rein him in.
No, I'm here for it. And I think there's an uncomfortable truth for a lot of straight men that inevitably, due to the, violence that queer people and women have experienced from straight men, they've gone off and formed their own circles and are having their own conversations and so on.
Yeah, for safety.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. And so it's understandable in a way that the conversation has become divided and polarized, especially online, where different communities have exist for safety and are kind of talking amongst themselves. And I just think the more we can kind of spend time having conversations like this,
bridging conversations, bridging people, bridging communities, for sure. Yeah. Because often, even if you go to like panels, that there's not a lot of, diversity in, in people, but just generally in thought as well. And I do think we just need to create those spaces and make more of an effort actually to go outside of our usual bubbles, whether it be like a social circle, work circle, whatever, because we do need that, that difference in expression.
Yeah.
And it might be uncomfortable. I remember when I started my youth work and I moved to an area of Brixton and I started volunteering in the community centre that was around the corner from where I'd moved to. And I was more or less the only white guy in the community centre. And it took 6 months before the people there were convinced I wasn't an undercover police officer and to build trust. And it was like really, hard to go in each time and to be met with suspicion and, distrust. But that process obviously taught me a lot. And then on the other side of that, through the kind of friction of two worlds coming together, we were able to then have a really positive experience. And I set up a discussion group for the young men there, and it all went really well. But I think there's always going to be, when there's a coming together of different people and different conversations, like a bit of friction at first.
Yeah, that tension, which is uncomfortable, but you kind of have to sit through it a little bit, don't you?
Yeah.
Do we have something?
Oh, golden ticket.
Oh my god! We've only done this 10 times.
Rory, we'd like to give you a drop dead generous golden ticket.
Whoa!
So we give one to all the guests that come on to the show as a way to say thank you. Through that code, you'll be able to collect a grant of $500, so about £380. And all we ask is basically that you pay it forward through an act of kindness. So spend it on doing something for someone else. As a project, we're giving 1,000 people $500 to try and unearth the breadth and depth of what human kindness actually looks like. So thank you.
Thank you. It's very generous. I'm excited to spend it. Yeah.
I almost forgot. If you have listened or watched this song, first of all, thank you. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Second of all, I would love if you would share this episode with your community. We put a lot of hard work into making it, and I, for one, would love to keep my job, but also continue to make the show. So the more people who listen and watch, the more likely it is that we get to keep making it, the more people we reach and hopefully help, and the more creators we get to platform. So thank you so much. Please do share it, and I'll see you next week.